After dedicating my life to my father's company, I found out he handed everything to my freeloading brother, just like that, no warning, no remorse, so I walked away without a word, but I had one final move in mind, and what came next turned their whole world into rubble. I'm Sean, I'm 41 years old, I'm tall, quiet, a little too patient for my own good. I've been loyal to a fault all my life. My younger brother Caleb is 36, he's flashy, reckless, always chasing the next shortcut. My dad Wayne is 68, a hard man, military background, never praised anyone, never smiled unless he was in control, and my mom, well, she passed 10 years ago, and I swear my dad's heart died with her. I grew up in the town of Brook Hollow, not big, not tiny, but just the kind of place where everyone knows who's related to who, and every family's secret is a wildfire waiting to happen. My dad built his logistics company from scratch when I was 10, started with one rusty truck and a promise that he'd leave behind an empire, and to his credit, he did. I watched him pour his blood into that business, and somewhere along the line I got pulled in too. I was 14 when I started sweeping the floors. By 16 I was riding shotgun on deliveries, and by 20 I was handling accounts and logistics. I put in the work, not because I expected anything, but because it felt right. It was ours, it was family, or so I thought. Meanwhile, Caleb, well, he was the golden boy. He got out of everything. I'm not exaggerating, I mean everything. When I was working summers in the warehouse, Caleb was skipping class and crashing into mailboxes with his friends and still somehow getting a pat on the back instead of a punishment. When he turned 19, my dad bought him a brand new Jeep Cherokee, while I was still paying off my used sedan with change I saved from gas station sandwiches. But I didn't complain, I never complained. I thought maybe if I just kept showing up, kept proving myself, one day it would pay off. I never wanted handouts, I just wanted to earn my place. When I was 25, my dad had a health scare, mild stroke, nothing too bad but it shook him, and suddenly I was promoted from floor manager to co-director of operations. I thought it was the moment I had waited for, but turns out it was just temporary, just a test, and apparently I passed, but not in the way I imagined. For the next 12 years I practically ran that company. I knew every client by name, negotiated every major contract, streamlined our whole inventory system, even brought in a new fleet deal that saved us over $500,000. I thought I was building something with him, beside him, but really I was just paving the road for someone else to walk on it. I should have seen the signs, the late-night dinners where he invited Caleb instead of me, the decisions he started making without my input even though I was the one staying until 11 p.m., the sudden trips Caleb took with him to learn the ropes even though he never stayed long enough to learn where the damn coffee was. But it all came crashing down the morning of the company's 30-year anniversary gala. My dad pulled me aside before the speeches and said, "I'd made my decision, son, you're not gonna like it, but it's done." I thought maybe he was stepping back, maybe letting us co-own or dividing shares, or hell, I don't own something fair, but no, he handed full ownership, full control, every damn thing to Caleb, just like that, didn't even flinch. I remember my heart didn't break right away, it just froze, like someone poured concrete into my chest. I couldn't speak, I just looked at him, waiting for him to laugh and say it was a joke, but he didn't. He just stood there in his sharp tuxedo like he was doing me a favor, like I was supposed to be grateful for being told to get out of the way. I didn't yell, I didn't argue, I just said, okay, and walked out of the building. I remember passing the ice sculpture at the buffet, Caleb's initials carved into it like some Roman emperor was being crowned. I went home to my apartment, sat on the floor for 4 hours with my phone off, didn't eat, didn't turn on the lights. I didn't cry, not because I wasn't devastated, but because I felt something deeper, something worse, like I had been erased from my own life, like every moment I spent building that place was a lie. I didn't show up to work the next day, or the next week, I never went back. They didn't even call to check on me, not even a text, they just kept going like I never mattered, and honestly, maybe to them I didn't. But here's the thing about being silent for too long, it teaches you how to listen, how to observe, and most importantly, how to plan. I didn't want revenge, not in the burning car kind of way. I wanted justice, I wanted truth, and if they thought I'd just fade away into nothing, they were wrong. I had one move left, and I knew exactly when to make it. I waited, quietly, patiently, while the empire I helped build slowly started to shift under Caleb's feet. Caleb didn't waste time making his mark on the company. Within 2 weeks of my quiet disappearance, he'd rebranded the whole damn fleet, swapped out the logo I designed for something that looked like a rejected sports drink label, fired 2 of our longest-running dispatchers because they didn't vibe with his new image, and started handing out executive titles to his poker buddies like they were candy. And my dad, well, He just watched from the sideline, smiling like a proud father at his kid's kindergarten recital, not realizing the kid was setting the curtains on fire behind him. It would have been funny if it wasn't so gut-wrenching. I watched it all from the outside, heard whispers from former co-workers who still respected me enough to keep me in the loop. They told me about late shipments, client complaints, inventory slipping through cracks, even a warehouse that accidentally got double billed 3 months in a row. But every time I got the urge to step in or say something, I'd remind myself this wasn't mine anymore. I was just a ghost now, and maybe that was exactly what I needed to be. I spent those first 2 months disappearing slowly, moved out of my apartment to a small cabin I rented off a retired vet in the mountains 3 towns over, got rid of my work phone, changed my email, stopped checking socials. I needed to vanish not just from their lives, but from the rhythm I'd been living in for decades. And in that silence, in that peace, I started writing down every piece of knowledge I had about that company, every process, every client preference, every loophole, every regulation they were skating close to breaking. I wasn't building a weapon, I was building a mirror, one that showed exactly how fragile their world really was. And then, I got a call from someone I didn't expect. Janice, our biggest client, CEO of Clear Reach Freight. I hadn't spoken to her in months, but she sounded pissed, not sad, not confused, furious. She said they'd been trying to get a meeting with someone for weeks, but Caleb kept pushing it off, sending in some guy named Milo who clearly had no clue what he was doing. She said, "Sean, what the hell's going on? Are you still part of this circus?" And I had to laugh, not because it was funny but because I realized just how fast everything was slipping through their fingers. I told her the truth, that I was no longer part of it, that I didn't even have a stake in the building anymore, and she went quiet for a second before saying, "What if you weren't tied to them? What if we brought you on to consult independently, quietly?" I didn't answer right away, not because I didn't want to, but because something clicked in that moment, something powerful. I said I'd think about it, and hung up, then spent the next 48 hours mapping out the future I never thought I'd get to build. I wasn't just going to move on, I was going to create something new, something that stood in direct contrast to the chaos Caleb was creating, something leaner, smarter, cleaner. I called Janice back, said I'd do it under one condition, that it stayed quiet, under the radar for at least 6 months. She agreed without hesitation, said she trusted me, that she'd been waiting for someone to bring back the kind of discipline and clarity the industry was lacking. That was the moment the first domino tipped. From there, things started moving fast. I pulled in a few trusted former employees who'd been laid off or pushed out. Brought in a software developer I knew from college who'd always wanted to design logistics dashboards but never got the chance, and started building from scratch. No big announcements, no press, just silent, consistent growth, while Caleb threw launch parties for products that didn't exist yet and burned through cash like it was monopoly money. And my dad, from what I heard, was starting to worry. He'd expected Caleb to stumble, sure, but not collapse, not bleed clients and contracts within months. And still, he didn't call me, not once, didn't ask where I was, didn't try to reach out. I was his eldest son, his business partner for years, and I was nothing to him now. But I wasn't angry anymore, I wasn't even hurt, I was focused. There's something about betrayal that sharpens you, clears your eyes, removes all the noise. And when I finally launched the first version of our system, I named it Resonant, because that's what truth does, it resonates, cuts through the lies. Within 3 months, we had 5 clients, within 5 more, 12, all people who'd quietly cut ties with my dad's company, not with explosions or lawsuits, just silence. That's what stung the most for them, I think, not the loss, but the fact that no one was making a scene. They were just slipping away, disappearing into something better. Meanwhile, Caleb started going on podcasts trying to spin the losses as restructuring and intentional brand realignment, but everyone in the industry could smell the desperation. And then came the nail in the coffin, a federal audit. Apparently some records had gone missing, some invoices misfiled, and suddenly the feds were knocking, and my dad, the man who prided himself on being ironclad, flawless, was under investigation. And guess who was the only one not mentioned in any of it? Me. I watched it unfold from my cabin, a cup of black coffee in my hand, the snow falling outside, and I realized I didn't need revenge, didn't need to scream, or fight, or tear anyone down. All I had to do was step away, and let the truth catch up to them on its own. It had been just over a year since I walked away from the empire I built with my own hands and watched it start collapsing from a distance, not because I wanted it to fall but because it was never mine to begin with, not in their eyes anyway. My dad had chosen Caleb to carry the torch and Caleb had set the whole place on fire and then blamed the wind. I had kept quiet through it all, not out of weakness but out of intention. I didn't want to get pulled into the mud fight they were drowning in. I wanted to build something real, something clean, and that's what Resonant had become. It started as a whisper, but now it was growing louder by the month. We weren't some tech unicorn or flashy headline company. We were steady, precise, respected. We made sure trucks got where they were supposed to go, on time and without drama, and that meant more than any logo or podcast appearance Caleb could buy. I was starting to breathe again. To really breathe, I got a dog. Her name's Maple, a mutt with too much energy and eyes that remind me not everything in life is complicated. She kept me grounded when the numbers on the screen felt too surreal, reminded me that sometimes just walking in the woods is enough. But the peace didn't last forever. I got a letter one morning, not an email, not a voicemail, a real envelope with my name scrawled in my dad's familiar block handwriting. It was short, maybe 10 lines, but every word carried weight. He said he was sorry, not for what he'd done but for how things had turned out, said the company was in trouble, deeper than he could admit, said he'd made mistakes, trusted the wrong person, said he missed me, missed the way things used to be, said he wanted to talk. I stared at that letter for hours, ran my fingers along the edge of the paper like it held answers it didn't, and I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to burn it, to let it turn to ash like all the expectations I had once carried for that man, but another part of me, the son part, the loyal fool part, wanted to see him, wanted to know if there was still a flicker of the father I remembered buried under the arrogance and control. So I went, not to forgive, not to forget, but to listen, to see for myself if there was anything left worth salvaging. We met at an old diner on the edge of town, the kind with chipped counters and coffee that tastes like it's been reheated 17 times. He looked older than I remembered, smaller too, like all the power had drained out of him slowly and he hadn't noticed until it was gone. He stood when he saw me, like we were still pretending to be polite, and said my name like it tasted unfamiliar. I sat across from him and waited, didn't say a word, just watched him squirm in his booth like a man who suddenly realized he'd lost the script. He said Caleb had made a series of bad investments, had pulled money from secured funds without telling anyone, had signed off on a warehouse lease in Nevada that never even broke ground. He said they'd lost their 3 biggest clients in the last 4 months and were hemorrhaging drivers. He said the federal audit had cleared him personally, but the damage to the company's reputation was deep, too deep. Then he looked at me and asked the question I was both expecting and dreading. He said, "Can you help us, Sean? Just look things over, maybe talk to a few partners, maybe." And that's when I held up my hand, not angrily, just firm, calm, and I said, "No," just like that, soft but final. And his eyes went wide, like he couldn't believe his own son would deny him. And that's when I realized, he still thought I owed him. After all this time, all this betrayal, he still believed I had some duty to pick up the mess he created. I told him I wasn't angry anymore. I told him I had built something new, something better, and I wasn't going to jeopardize it to save the wreckage of his ego. He looked like he wanted to argue, to throw one of his old speeches at me about loyalty and family and legacy. But he just deflated, like an old balloon finally accepting the party was over. I paid for the coffee and left without looking back, and when I got home, I felt this strange mix of sadness and clarity, like closing a book you loved once but could never finish because the pages were too soaked in lies. And then came the call. It was Caleb, and I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. His voice was shaky, not drunk but close. He said he knew I'd been building something, said he'd seen the shift, the way old clients were drifting toward some mysterious new system, said he needed a win, needed help, said he was drowning and Dad didn't have the answers anymore. And then he did something I didn't expect. He cried, full-on sobbed into the phone, and I didn't know how to respond. I'd spent my whole life watching him lie and manipulate and charm his way out of consequences, but this sounded real, like a man who finally realized no one was coming to save him, not even Daddy. I told him I wasn't coming back, not ever, but that he had one chance left to sell his shares, all of them, walk away clean, let someone else rebuild what he destroyed. I told him I had a buyer in mind, a former competitor with the resources to salvage what was left if given the room to move. He hesitated, begged, pleaded, said he couldn't just walk away, said he didn't know how to be anything else, and I said, "That's not my problem," and hung up, and I thought that was the end of it. I really did, until 2 weeks later when I got a call from Janice again, laughing, full belly laughing on the other end of the line. She said, "Guess who just offered to sell his stake in your dad's company for pennies on the dollar?" And I didn't have to guess, I knew. Caleb had folded, probably out of desperation but maybe, just maybe, out of understanding. And the deal went through fast, clean, surgical, and with that one quiet move, the company was out of the family's hands, and into new ones, stable ones, ones that respected process and truth, and I sat in my cabin with Maple by my side and realized it was over, not with fireworks or headlines, but with quiet power, with stillness, the same stillness that taught me how to wait, how to watch, how to strike without noise. After the sale was finalized, everything got quieter, not just around me, but inside me too, like the storm had passed and left this strange calm in its wake, not peace exactly, but something like it. I didn't celebrate, didn't pour a drink or shout into the woods or dance around the cabin. I just stood there in my kitchen with the kettle hissing behind me and felt the shift, like something heavy had been pulled from my chest without me noticing. For the first time in my life, I didn't know anyone anything, not my father, not my brother, not even my own past. I had no debt left to pay, no legacy to protect that wasn't of my own making, and that silence was louder than anything I'd ever heard. But life has a way of tugging at you when you start to feel steady, and it wasn't long before it came knocking, not in some dramatic way, but in the form of a letter again, this time not from my father or Caleb, but from a woman named Lori. I hadn't heard that name in years, not since we were teenagers, not since she left town and never looked back. She'd been my first real love, the kind of love that made everything else look pale and half-formed. We were inseparable for 3 years until she left for college out west and never returned. I tried to write, called her once or twice, but then life happened, and I buried that part of me like everything else that hurt too much to look at, and now, here she was, writing me like we had coffee just last week. She said she'd heard what happened from her aunt who still lived in Brookhollow, said she was sorry about how everything turned out but also proud of me, proud that I didn't let it break me. She said she was back in town temporarily, settling her late father's estate and trying to make sense of the old house on Grant Street, and she ended it with, "If you ever want to talk, I'll be here for a while." And I stared at that last sentence like it held a key to something I didn't know I'd locked. I didn't respond right away. Didn't even know what to say, but 3 nights later I found myself driving into town, not to see her exactly, just to remember it, remember what it felt like to be young and wide-eyed before responsibility hardened everything into sacrifice. The house on Grant Street looked the same, a little more weathered, but the porch swing still creaked the way it used to, and she was there, like a memory brought to life, standing barefoot on the porch in an old hoodie with paint smudges on her hands, and when she saw me, she smiled, not surprised, not hesitant, just warm, like I'd never left. We talked for hours that night, about nothing and everything, about her life in Oregon, about her divorce, about the career she built and walked away from, about how she missed small things like the smell of pine in the morning and thunderstorms that roll in slow. She asked about the company, about my dad, about Caleb, and I told her enough to fill in the gaps, but not the whole story. Some parts still felt too tender, too raw. But she listened, really listened, in that way only a few people ever do. And when I left that night, I felt something stir in me, not hope exactly, not yet, but the memory of it. And over the next few weeks, we saw each other more. Coffee turned into dinner, dinner turned into late night walks around the lake where we used to skip stones and talk about running away together. And slowly, like the ice melting off a mountain, I started to feel human again. I hadn't realized how numb I'd become, how much of myself I'd buried under expectations and disappointments. But she didn't ask for anything, didn't try to fix me. She just showed up, again and again, until one night she asked me if I ever thought about leaving, really leaving, not running away but starting over somewhere else, someplace without the ghosts. And I looked at her and realized I didn't want to leave, not because of the town, but because for the first time in decades, I wasn't alone in it. And just as that truth settled in my chest, like a flame warming my ribs, I got a call that cracked it all open again. It was my father, but not his voice. It was a nurse. She said he'd collapsed during a board meeting and had been admitted with a cardiac episode, not a full heart attack, but enough to scare them. Said he was asking for me, only me, and I didn't know what to feel, not anger, not relief, just that old pull again, that damn thread of responsibility I thought I'd finally cut. I told her I'd come in the morning, and Lori didn't ask if I was going. She just kissed my hand and said, "Don't let him take any more from you." And that stuck with me all night. Those words echoed like thunder in my chest as I sat by my fireplace with Maple curled up at my feet and the wind rattling the windows like it was trying to say something I couldn't yet hear. When morning came, I drove to the hospital not because he deserved it, but because I needed it. I needed to see him one last time. With clear eyes and a clear heart, when I walked into that room, he looked even smaller than before, pale, hooked up to machines. The man who once barked orders like God himself now barely able to hold a cup of water. He looked up at me and tried to smile, said my name like it hurt to say, and then he whispered, "You were always the strong one," and I didn't know whether to laugh or scream or cry. I just nodded and sat down beside him. And for the first time in my life, we didn't argue, didn't posture, we just sat in silence, two men who had finally run out of things to prove, and I realized in that moment, he was never going to give me what I needed, not closure, not justice, not an apology that mattered, but maybe I didn't need it anymore, maybe letting go wasn't losing, maybe it was winning in a way he could never understand. After I left that hospital room, I didn't feel lighter, not really. It's strange how even when you let go of something you've carried for years, the weight doesn't just disappear, it lingers, like an imprint in your shoulders where the pressure used to sit. I walked out into the parking lot just before sunrise, that pale blue light stretching across the sky like a quiet sigh, and for a moment, I just stood there, watching the world wake up, and I thought about everything I'd been through. Everything I'd let happen, everything I'd finally stopped allowing. I thought about the boy I used to be, the one who thought loyalty would eventually be rewarded, the one who worked weekends and holidays and didn't ask for anything back because he thought love and respect were automatic when it came to family. I thought about Caleb, how he'd looked in that voicemail he left me the night after he signed away his shares, his voice low and tired. He didn't ask for forgiveness, not really, but he did say something I didn't expect. He said, "You were right, Sean, not just about me, about everything." I didn't want to admit it, but you always saw the cracks before anyone else did. And I saved that voicemail, not because I needed validation, but because it reminded me of how long I'd waited to hear even a fraction of the truth from him. And then I thought about Lori, about how her presence hadn't fixed anything but had helped me remember who I was underneath the armor I'd built, how love isn't about being needed, it's about being seen. And she saw me, fully, without judgment, without expectation, and when I got back to the cabin later that day, Maple jumped on me like I'd been gone a week, and Lori was already there, barefoot again, standing on my porch with 2 mugs of tea and a look that said everything without needing to say a word, and for the first time, I let myself believe it was okay to rest, not to quit, not to surrender, but to stop running, stop proving, stop bracing for impact. We spent the next few months in a kind of rhythm I didn't know I needed, quiet mornings, hikes through the woods, laughter over burned toast and spilled coffee, and slowly, the memory of what my father took from me faded into something smaller, like a scar instead of an open wound. And then one morning, out of the blue, I got a certified envelope at my cabin, no return address, just my name written in sharp, tidy strokes. I opened it slowly, expecting some legal leftover mess from the company or maybe something from Caleb, but it was a will. A revised one, dated just days before my father's collapse, and as I read it, my hands started to shake, not from anger, not from sadness, but from something I couldn't quite name yet. He'd left everything to me, not just what was left of the company, which had already changed hands, but the house, the land it sat on, a few investments I hadn't known existed, and most surprising of all, a journal, not typed, handwritten, almost 200 pages of notes and thoughts and memories. It wasn't an apology, not in the clean, simple way people want one, but it was something else, something raw. He wrote about his fears, his pride, his disappointment, not just in me, but in himself. He wrote about how losing Mom had cracked him open in ways he never wanted to admit, how he pushed me harder than he should have because I reminded him of her fire, her quiet strength, how he always thought I didn't need praise because I was already good, already strong, and how he realized too late that strength needs love too, that recognition isn't weakness, it's survival. And I sat on my porch for hours that day, reading every word, some pages stained with what I think were his tears, and I didn't know whether to hate him more or forgive him completely, but in the end, I did neither. I just accepted him for what he was, a flawed man who hurt the people he loved while trying to protect them from the world, and maybe himself, and it didn't make what he did right, it didn't erase the years I lost, but it gave me something I hadn't expected, context, and with that, I made a decision. I didn't want the house, too many ghosts, and I didn't want the money, it felt too tangled in history, so I sold the property to a non-profit that builds recovery centers for veterans, and I donated the rest of the inheritance to local causes, the ones that actually change lives quietly, the way I had learned to do. And as for the journal, I kept it, not as a shrine, but as a reminder that even the people who hurt us can be more than their worst moments, and maybe someday I'll pass it on, maybe not, but for now it sits on my shelf next to the first prototype of resonance logistics software, which is now used by over 70 companies across the region, and we're growing, not by millions, but by trust, one client at a time, no press releases, no flashy launches, just solid work and honest connections. And as for Lori, she never left. She moved in 6 months after that letter arrived and started teaching art classes in town, we adopted another dog, a quiet old lab named Gus who limps a little but has the biggest heart, and sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, not from nightmares, but from silence, and I smile, because I know I'm finally living in a life I chose, not one I inherited, and if I've learned anything through all of this, it's that you can give someone your time, your sweat, your loyalty, but if they don't value it, you don't owe them your future, and sometimes walking away isn't the end of the story, it's where the real story begins. Thanks for watching. If you liked the story, hit like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more crazy twists. See you in the next one.